August 15, 1945, dawned over Japan with an eerie stillness that belied the catastrophe about to unfold. Squadron leader Kazuki Yasuhiko stood on the tarmac of Atsugi Naval Air Base, his flight boots planted firmly on concrete still warm from the previous day's sun. Around him, 373 aircraft sat in perfect formation, their propellers motionless, their fuselages bearing the crimson circle of the rising sun. These weren't just machines. They were the last breath of an empire that had once commanded the Pacific skies, now reduced to a graveyard of ambitions waiting for its final directive. The morning Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across the nation, announcing surrender. Kazuki had already known this day was coming. The atomic fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had illuminated more than cities. They had exposed the futility of continued resistance. Yet standing among his fellow pilots, men whose faces bore the same mixture of shame and relief, he understood that surrender meant something far more complex than simply laying down arms. It meant the systematic dismantling of everything they had been trained to revere. Major General Curtis LeMay of the United States Army Air Forces had spent months orchestrating the firebombing campaign that turned Japan's cities into pyres. His strategic bombing doctrine had evolved from precision strikes to area bombardment, a shift that reflected the brutal arithmetic of total war. According to documentation from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted in the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, American forces had destroyed approximately 2.3 million buildings and killed between 300,000 and 900,000 Japanese civilians through conventional bombing alone. The atomic weapons had merely accelerated an inevitable conclusion. Now came the next phase of America's aerial dominance, one less discussed in the grand narratives of victory: the complete erasure of Japan's ability to wage war from the sky. The terms of surrender, outlined in the Potsdam Declaration and formalized aboard the USS Missouri, were unambiguous. Japan would be demilitarized, its armed forces would be dissolved, its weapons would be confiscated or destroyed. But the scope of this undertaking, particularly regarding aviation, would prove staggering in both scale and psychological impact. Kazuki watched as American occupation forces began arriving at air bases across the Japanese archipelago. They came with clipboards and cameras, methodically cataloging every aircraft, every spare part, every technical manual. The process was clinical, almost surgical in its precision. Teams of American engineers moved through hangars with the efficiency of accountants auditing a failing business, except their ledgers recorded the remnants of military power rather than financial assets. The 373 planes represented on that single day were merely the beginning. Across Japan, thousands more aircraft awaited similar fates. Fighter planes that had defended the homeland during desperate kamikaze campaigns, bombers that had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized China, training aircraft that had transformed farmers' sons into warriors of the sky. All would vanish, systematically erased by an occupying power determined to ensure Japan could never again threaten the Pacific Order. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945 lasted exactly 23 minutes, but its implications would resonate through decades of Japanese history. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, accepted Japan's unconditional surrender with words that mixed magnanimity with unmistakable authority. He spoke of peace and reconstruction, yet the military apparatus he commanded was already executing a plan of unprecedented scope: the complete neutralization of Japanese military aviation. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Armstrong, tasked with coordinating aircraft disposal operations in the Kanto region, arrived at Atsugi with specific instructions from MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. His orders, preserved in National Archives records, detailed a three-phase approach to handling Japan's remaining air assets. Phase 1 involved comprehensive inventory and assessment. Phase 2 required the segregation of aircraft by type and condition. Phase 3, the most dramatic, mandated destruction of all military aircraft except those selected for intelligence evaluation or museum preservation. Armstrong was no stranger to aviation warfare. He had commanded bomber groups over Europe, participated in the strategic planning that devastated German industrial capacity, and understood aircraft not merely as weapons, but as symbols of national capability. When he surveyed the rows of Japanese planes at Atsugi, he saw something beyond defeated machinery. He recognized the technological sophistication that had enabled Japan to dominate Asian skies for years, the engineering prowess that had produced the legendary Zero fighter, and the industrial capacity that had sustained aerial operations across an oceanic theater of war. The Japanese had developed remarkable aircraft during the conflict. The Mitsubishi A6M0 possessed exceptional range and maneuverability that initially outclassed American fighters. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber had been instrumental in the Pearl Harbor attack. The Kawanishi H-8K flying boat represented advanced maritime patrol capabilities. These weren't primitive machines hastily assembled. They were products of sophisticated aeronautical engineering that had evolved over decades of military development. Yet technological prowess alone could not overcome the industrial and resource disparities that ultimately doomed Japan's war effort. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, by war's end, Japan's aircraft production had collapsed from a peak of 2,800 planes monthly in mid-1944 to fewer than 1,000 by early 1945. Fuel shortages, raw material scarcities, bombing damage to factories, and the loss of experienced pilots had rendered Japan's air forces increasingly ineffective, despite continued manufacturing efforts. Armstrong's inventory teams discovered aircraft in various states of readiness. Some were pristine, recently manufactured and never flown in combat. Others bore battle damage, patched and repaired repeatedly as spare parts became scarce. Many had been cannibalized to keep other planes operational, their engines removed, instruments stripped, anything valuable redistributed to machines still capable of flight. The desperation of Japan's final months was written in aluminum and steel across every airfield. The assessment process revealed telling patterns. Maintenance logs showed declining flight hours as fuel allocations dwindled. Training records documented pilots being rushed through abbreviated programs, their preparation measured in weeks rather than the months or years required for genuine proficiency. Technical reports noted modifications and improvisations born of necessity, Japanese engineers adapting designs to accommodate inferior substitute materials as Allied submarines and bombers severed supply chains. Kozuki observed the Americans at work with complex emotions. Pride in the machines his nation had created mingled with shame at their defeat. He had flown these aircraft, trusted his life to their construction, and witnessed their evolution from instruments of conquest to tools of desperate defense. Now they were becoming historical artifacts, specimens for American study, or scrap metal awaiting destruction. While destruction crews prepared equipment for the wholesale elimination of Japan's air fleet, another group of Americans pursued a different objective: technological espionage. Captain Harold Watson, technical intelligence officer attached to the United States Army Air Forces, led specialized teams tasked with identifying aircraft and technologies valuable for American study. His mission represented the intellectual dimension of occupation, the systematic extraction of enemy innovations that might advance American aviation. Watson had studied Japanese aircraft throughout the war, analyzing wreckage recovered from Pacific battlefields, interrogating captured pilots, and reviewing intelligence reports compiled from multiple sources. He understood that Japan, despite losing the war, had developed specific capabilities worthy of respect and emulation. The challenge now was separating genuinely valuable technology from merely interesting curiosities, prioritizing which aircraft and systems warranted preservation and detailed analysis. The technical intelligence teams focused particular attention on several aircraft types. The Mitsubishi J-8M Shusui, Japan's rocket-powered interceptor based on German designs, represented cutting-edge propulsion technology. The Nakajima Kika, Japan's jet aircraft program, demonstrated indigenous turbojet development. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the infamous kamikaze rocket bomb, embodied a disturbing but tactically significant weapon concept. Each represented technological paths that might inform American post-war aviation development. Watson's teams employed methodical documentation procedures. Engineers photographed aircraft from multiple angles, measuring dimensions, examining construction techniques, and testing materials. Interpreters translated technical manuals, maintenance logs, and design documentation. Specialists dismantled engines, studying metallurgy, machining tolerances, and engineering solutions to problems American designers had addressed differently. The process transformed Japanese military aircraft into textbooks, their every component becoming a lesson in comparative aeronautical engineering. The intelligence harvest extended beyond physical aircraft to institutional knowledge. American teams interviewed Japanese engineers, designers, and test pilots, extracting information about development processes, testing methodologies, and operational experiences. These conversations, conducted through interpreters in occupied facilities across Japan, revealed the human dimensions of technological development. Japanese aviation had emerged from specific institutional cultures, constrained by particular resource limitations, and shaped by distinct strategic priorities. Understanding these contexts was as valuable as understanding the hardware itself. According to declassified technical intelligence reports referenced in subsequent aviation history studies, American evaluators were particularly impressed by certain aspects of Japanese design philosophy. The Zero's emphasis on range and maneuverability, achieved through weight reduction and aerodynamic efficiency, demonstrated sophisticated prioritization of capabilities suited to Pacific theater operations. Japanese naval aviation had pioneered carrier operations techniques that influenced post-war American practices. Even in defeat, Japanese aviation contributed to the Allied understanding of air warfare. However, the intelligence teams also documented significant Japanese limitations. Manufacturing quality varied substantially, with later war production showing declining precision as experienced workers were conscripted and factories operated under increasingly difficult conditions. Material science lagged behind American and German standards, forcing compromises in engine performance and airframe durability. Most critically, training systems had collapsed under the pressures of attrition, producing pilots inadequately prepared for combat against experienced American aviators flying superior aircraft. Kazuki found himself among those interviewed by American technical intelligence officers. Through an interpreter, he described his training, his combat experiences, and his assessments of various aircraft types. The Americans listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions that revealed their sophisticated understanding of aviation. The experience was strange, almost surreal. Yesterday he had been an enemy combatant. Today he was an information source, his expertise extracted like ore from a mine, refined and processed for someone else's benefit. The interview touched on sensitive subjects. Kazuki described the declining quality of replacement pilots, the desperation of kamikaze tactics, and the increasingly futile missions flown as American forces tightened their stranglehold on Japan. He spoke carefully, maintaining dignity while acknowledging the obvious realities of defeat. The American officers treated him with professional courtesy, neither celebrating victory nor mocking defeat, simply extracting information with clinical efficiency. October 1st, 1945 marked the formal implementation of aircraft disposal operations across occupied Japan. General MacArthur's headquarters issued comprehensive directives specifying procedures, timelines, and accountability measures for eliminating Japanese military aviation capabilities. The orders were bureaucratically precise, transforming strategic imperatives into administrative checklists, but their execution would prove both physically demanding and psychologically devastating for Japanese personnel forced to participate. Colonel Armstrong coordinated disposal operations at major airfields in the Tokyo region, where concentrations of aircraft awaited destruction. His teams had completed inventories, segregated aircraft selected for intelligence study, and prepared equipment for the systematic dismantling or demolition of everything else. The scale was staggering. At Atsugi alone, 214 aircraft required disposal. Across the Kanto Plain, hundreds more awaited similar fates. Nationwide, estimates suggested over 10,000 military aircraft existed in various conditions, all marked for elimination. The Americans employed multiple disposal methods depending on circumstances and aircraft conditions. Airworthy planes not selected for intelligence study were flown to designated disposal sites, then systematically destroyed. Non-flyable aircraft were dismantled where they sat, their components separated and rendered unusable. In some cases, aircraft were simply bulldozed into pits and buried. The most dramatic method involved mass burnings, where dozens of planes were doused with fuel and incinerated simultaneously, their aluminum frames melting into unrecognizable slag. Japanese personnel were compelled to assist in this destruction. Mechanics who had maintained these aircraft now removed engines and drained fuel tanks. Armament technicians who had installed weapons now cut through fuselages with acetylene torches. Pilots who had flown combat missions now taxied planes to demolition sites, then walked away as American crews rigged explosives or applied torches. The psychological burden was immense. These men were not merely witnessing defeat, they were actively participating in the erasure of their military identity. Kazuki was assigned to a disposal crew at Atsugi. His first task involved preparing a Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft type he had flown numerous times, for destruction. He climbed into the familiar cockpit one final time, running through pre-flight checks from muscle memory even though the plane would never fly again. The instrument panel, the control stick, the throttle, all felt exactly as they always had, but their purpose had inverted. He was no longer preparing for combat but facilitating elimination. He taxied the Zero to a designated area where dozens of other aircraft sat in neat rows awaiting destruction. American soldiers directed him with hand signals, their gestures professional but impersonal. Kazuki shut down the engine, completed the post-flight checklist one last time, then climbed out. An American photographer documented the moment, capturing images that would later appear in occupation archives. Kazuki walked away without looking back, his jaw set, his emotions carefully controlled. The mass burning began that afternoon. American crews doused the assembled aircraft with aviation fuel, creating an accelerant that would ensure complete destruction. They established safety perimeters, positioned fire equipment, and verified that all personnel were clear. Then they ignited the fuel. The flames erupted with shocking speed and intensity, fueled by gasoline and aluminum, producing thick black smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. The heat was tremendous, forcing observers to retreat further. The sound was a continuous roar, punctuated by explosions as fuel tanks burst and ammunition cooked off. Kazuki watched from a distance, standing among other Japanese personnel who had been part of the disposal crews. Nobody spoke. The silence among the Japanese was profound, broken only by the distant roar of the flames and occasional pops of exploding ordnance. They were witnessing the immolation of their air force, the literal burning of capabilities that had represented Japan's technological modernity and military power. The smoke rising into the October sky served as a funeral pyre for an empire that had sought dominion over Asia and met catastrophic defeat. The burning continued for hours. As aircraft were consumed, American bulldozers pushed the twisted molten remains into prepared pits. The disposal was comprehensive, designed to ensure nothing salvageable remained. Even the ashes would be buried, the ground leveled, the airfield repurposed for occupation forces. The Americans were not merely destroying aircraft, they were erasing the physical infrastructure of Japanese military aviation. The aircraft disposal operations extended beyond mere physical destruction to encompass the systematic dismantling of institutional structures, professional identities, and individual purposes. For tens of thousands of Japanese aviation personnel, military and civilian alike, the elimination of Japan's air forces meant more than unemployment. It represented the annihilation of expertise, the obsolescence of skills honed over years, and the erasure of social status attached to aviation professions in militarized Japanese society. Lieutenant Tanaka Hiroshi had served as a maintenance officer at Yokosuka Naval Air Arsenal, supervising teams responsible for overhauling engines and repairing damaged aircraft. His technical knowledge was extensive, accumulated through formal training and practical experience spanning the entire Pacific War. He understood the intricacies of radial engines, the properties of aviation aluminum alloys, and the complex systems that enabled powered flight. This expertise had granted him status and purpose. Now it was becoming worthless, relevant only to machines being systematically destroyed. Tanaka watched as American teams dismantled the workshops and facilities where he had spent years working. Precision tools were confiscated or destroyed. Technical libraries were seized, their manuals and drawings cataloged for American study or incineration. Manufacturing equipment was tagged for removal to American facilities or demolition. The physical infrastructure of Japanese aviation was being liquidated as thoroughly as the aircraft themselves. The psychological impact on aviation personnel was profound. Many had dedicated their entire adult lives to military aviation, entering service in their teens or early 20s and knowing no other profession. Their identities were inseparable from their military roles. They were pilots, navigators, mechanics, engineers, occupations that had commanded respect in wartime Japan. The occupation's dismantling of military aviation stripped away these identities, leaving individuals uncertain of their place in a defeated nation undergoing forced transformation. Some adapted more successfully than others. Younger personnel, those with incomplete training or brief service records, found it easier to transition into civilian life. They had not fully internalized military aviation culture and could more readily adopt new occupations. Older veterans, especially career officers and senior enlisted personnel, struggled. Their skills were highly specialized, their worldviews shaped by decades of military service, their prospects in peacetime uncertain. The occupation offered minimal support for these displaced professionals, focusing instead on broader demilitarization objectives. The broader Japanese aviation industry faced existential crisis. Manufacturers like Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Kawasaki had devoted their production capacity entirely to military contracts during the war. Their factories, already damaged by American bombing, now faced the complete elimination of their market. Occupation authorities prohibited aircraft manufacturing entirely, eliminating the commercial aviation sector alongside military production. Engineers and workers found themselves jobless, their expertise in aircraft construction temporarily valueless in occupied Japan. According to historical research on Japan's post-war economic recovery, published in various academic studies of the occupation period, approximately 300,000 Japanese had been employed directly in aircraft manufacturing at the war's peak, with hundreds of thousands more in supporting industries. The occupation's aviation prohibitions rendered this entire sector dormant. Some factories attempted conversion to other products, manufacturing pots and pans, bicycle parts, or construction materials with their remaining equipment. These efforts provided limited employment and generated minimal revenue compared to wartime production levels. The Allied occupation authorities, primarily American but nominally multinational, justified these harsh measures as necessary to prevent Japanese rearmament. The memory of Pearl Harbor, the brutality of Japanese military conduct throughout Asia, and the fanatical resistance encountered in places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima had convinced American policymakers that Japan must be rendered permanently incapable of waging aggressive war. Aircraft, as strategic weapons capable of projecting power across vast distances, received particular attention in demilitarization planning. Kazuki, like many former pilots, struggled to find purpose in occupied Japan. The skills that had defined his identity, navigation, aircraft handling, tactical awareness, leadership under combat stress, had no apparent civilian applications. He was 32 years old, healthy and capable, but his expertise was in warfare, specifically aerial warfare, a domain Japan was now forbidden from practicing. He took manual labor jobs, working construction on projects rebuilding Tokyo's bombed-out neighborhoods, earning subsistence wages and contemplating an uncertain future. The social dynamics of defeat compounded these personal struggles. Japanese who had served in aviation, particularly pilots, had occupied elevated social positions during the war. Their uniforms commanded respect, their experiences were valorized, their sacrifices honored. In defeat, this status inverted. Some civilians blamed military personnel for the catastrophe that had befallen Japan, viewing them as perpetrators of aggressive war rather than defenders of the nation. Others simply wanted to forget the war entirely, moving forward rather than dwelling on painful memories. The American decision to eliminate Japanese aviation capabilities so comprehensively reflected strategic calculations developed over years of planning for post-war Asia. Senior American policymakers and military leaders understood that aircraft, more than any other weapon system, had enabled Japan's imperial expansion and sustained its ability to wage war across vast Pacific distances. Ensuring Japan could never again threaten American interests or regional stability required not merely temporary disarmament, but fundamental dismantling of aviation infrastructure and expertise. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces throughout the war, had advocated for air power as the decisive factor in modern warfare. His strategic perspective emphasized that control of the air domain determined outcomes in all other domains. This conviction shaped American thinking about Japanese disarmament. If air power was indeed decisive, then eliminating Japanese air power permanently became essential to ensuring lasting peace. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, which Arnold had overseen, had demonstrated American air superiority's devastating effectiveness. Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, had ranged across Japan largely unopposed, reducing cities to ash and crippling industrial production. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while conducted with B-29s, represented the ultimate expression of air power's strategic potential. This experience convinced American planners that preventing future Japanese air power development was paramount. However, the American approach also reflected broader geopolitical considerations extending beyond bilateral U.S.-Japan relations. The emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union, already evident in late 1945, influenced occupation policies. American strategists recognized that a demilitarized Japan would require American protection against potential Soviet expansion in Asia. This dependency suited American interests, ensuring Japan's alignment with American strategic objectives throughout the anticipated confrontation with communism. The aircraft disposal operations, therefore, served multiple purposes simultaneously. They eliminated immediate Japanese military capabilities, preventing any potential resurgence of militarism. They demonstrated American power to both Japanese and regional audiences, establishing occupation authority. They removed temptation for Japanese revanchism by liquidating the tools of warfare. They created Japanese dependency on American security guarantees, binding Japan into the American sphere of influence. The burning aircraft were symbols as much as weapons, their destruction communicating America's comprehensive victory and Japan's comprehensive defeat. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, commanding 8th Army Occupation Forces in Japan, understood the psychological dimensions of disarmament. His memoirs, later published and referenced in historical analyses of the occupation, described aircraft disposal as essential to convincing both Japanese military personnel and civilians that the war was genuinely over, that militarism had failed catastrophically, and that Japan's future lay in peaceful reconstruction under American guidance. The visible destruction of military hardware reinforced these messages more effectively than proclamations or regulations. The disposal operations also served practical intelligence and counter-proliferation objectives. American planners worried that Japanese aircraft or aviation technology might fall into Soviet hands, either through espionage or through Japanese technicians seeking employment with communist powers. Comprehensive destruction eliminated this risk. Similarly, concerns existed about potential Japanese collaboration with nationalist movements throughout Asia, particularly in China, where civil war between communists and nationalists was intensifying. Denying Japanese aviation expertise and equipment to any potential adversary served American strategic interests. The 373 aircraft that vanished on specific days represented merely the most dramatic instances of a prolonged campaign. Disposal operations extended throughout late 1945 and into 1946, gradually eliminating thousands of aircraft from airfields, storage facilities, and factories across Japan. American forces maintained meticulous records, documenting serial numbers, disposal methods, and final disposition of materials. This bureaucratic thoroughness ensured accountability and prevented unauthorized retention of aviation assets. Kazuki eventually learned the full scope of the disposal campaign through conversations with other former aviation personnel. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggested that between 10,000 and 12,000 military aircraft existed in Japan at surrender, representing every type from frontline fighters to obsolete trainers. By mid-1946, virtually all had been destroyed, buried, or shipped to American facilities for intelligence exploitation. Japan's skies, once filled with military aircraft, were now empty except for occasional American transports and the beginning of limited civilian aviation under strict occupation control. The thoroughness of the elimination impressed and disturbed him simultaneously. The Americans had approached disarmament with the same methodical efficiency they had brought to warfare itself. Every aircraft accounted for, every disposal documented, every potential avenue for retention or concealment closed. The occupation forces were not merely defeating Japan. They were remaking it, ensuring that the nation that emerged from occupation would be fundamentally different from the imperial power that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Among the thousands of aircraft marked for destruction, American technical intelligence teams identified approximately 300 warranting preservation for detailed study. These aircraft represented significant technological achievements, unusual design approaches, or capabilities requiring deeper understanding. They were segregated from the disposal stream, carefully prepared for transportation, and shipped to American facilities where engineers and scientists would dissect, test, and analyze them in exhaustive detail. Captain Watson's technical intelligence teams faced difficult decisions about which aircraft to preserve. Resources for transportation and storage were limited. Not everything interesting could be saved. Priorities favored jet and rocket-powered aircraft, representing cutting-edge propulsion technologies. Specialized variants and experimental types received consideration, offering insights into Japanese development priorities and engineering capabilities. Particularly well-preserved examples of significant types were selected as representative specimens. The Mitsubishi J-8M Shusui exemplified aircraft prioritized for preservation. This rocket-powered interceptor, based on Germany's Messerschmitt Me-163 but incorporating Japanese modifications, represented Japan's attempt to develop high-performance point defense fighters capable of countering American bomber formations. Only a handful had been completed before surrender, making intact examples rare. American engineers were particularly interested in the rocket propulsion system, a technology they were simultaneously developing, but approached differently. The Nakajima Kika, Japan's twin-jet aircraft, also received preservation priority. This small bomber, influenced by German jet technology but incorporating indigenous Japanese engineering, demonstrated Japan's ability to develop turbojet propulsion independently. While inferior to American and German jet aircraft in performance, the Kika proved that Japanese aeronautical engineers understood the principles of jet propulsion and could manufacture functioning turbojet engines despite wartime resource constraints. Perhaps most disturbing to American evaluators were aircraft specifically designed for suicide attacks. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a piloted rocket bomb carried beneath Betty bombers and released near target ships, represented the ultimate expression of Japan's willingness to employ suicide tactics. American forces had encountered these weapons in combat, losing several ships to Oka attacks. Preserved examples allowed detailed study of their construction, guidance systems, and tactical employment, helping American planners understand the psychology and methodology of suicide warfare. Less dramatic but technically significant were preserved examples of conventional aircraft types that had proven particularly effective in combat. Several Mitsubishi A6M0s were saved, representing different production variants and allowing American engineers to trace the type's evolution. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, instrumental in the Pearl Harbor attack, were preserved to study torpedo delivery systems and carrier aviation techniques. Kawanishi flying boats, notable for their range and seakeeping abilities, offered insights into maritime patrol operations. The preserved aircraft were meticulously prepared for shipment. Disassembly crews removed wings and empennages, preparing airframes for crating. Engines were drained, preserved against corrosion, and packed separately. Instruments, weapon systems, and specialized equipment were cataloged and protected. Technical documentation, when available, accompanied the physical hardware. Each aircraft became a carefully packaged archive of Japanese aviation technology, ready for transportation across the Pacific to American evaluation facilities. Most preserved Japanese aircraft were shipped to Naval Air Station Norfolk or Wright Field in Ohio, where specialized technical intelligence units awaited them. These facilities housed teams of engineers, test pilots, and technical specialists tasked with evaluating foreign aviation technology. Japanese aircraft joined German and Italian specimens in hangar laboratories, where America's aeronautical establishment systematically extracted knowledge from defeated enemies. The evaluation process was exhaustive. Engineers measured every dimension, tested every material, analyzed every design choice. Metallurgists examined alloy compositions, identifying Japanese approaches to materials science and manufacturing techniques. Propulsion specialists disassembled engines completely, studying everything from combustion chambers to supercharger designs. Aerodynamicists conducted wind tunnel testing when possible, evaluating performance characteristics. Test pilots flew those aircraft sufficiently airworthy, providing subjective assessments of handling, performance, and combat capabilities. According to declassified technical intelligence reports from this period, referenced in aviation history texts, American evaluators developed grudging respect for certain aspects of Japanese aviation technology while identifying significant limitations. The Zero's maneuverability impressed test pilots, though its vulnerability to damage and lack of pilot protection reflected different prioritization of capabilities. Japanese aircraft engines, while mechanically sound in design, suffered from inferior metallurgy and manufacturing quality compared to American power plants. Overall, Japanese aviation technology was assessed as capable but constrained by resource limitations and industrial capacity shortfalls. Kozuki never learned the fate of specific aircraft he had flown or maintained. The Americans provided no information to Japanese personnel about which aircraft were preserved or destroyed. For him, and thousands like him, the aircraft simply vanished, disappeared into occupation bureaucracy, their fates unknown. Years later, he would discover photographs in aviation history books showing Japanese aircraft in American museums, preserved behind velvet ropes, their combat histories reduced to plaques and labels. The survivors existed as educational artifacts, stripped of operational purpose but maintaining physical presence. The vast majority of Japanese aircraft, however, experienced no such preservation. They were destroyed completely, transformed from sophisticated machines into scrap metal, ashes, or buried wreckage. Their disappearance was total, erasure so complete that subsequent generations of Japanese could hardly imagine the extent of their nation's wartime aviation capabilities. The destruction of existing aircraft represented only the first phase of American efforts to eliminate Japanese aviation capabilities. The occupation authorities implemented comprehensive prohibitions on all aviation-related activities, from manufacturing to pilot training to aeronautical research. These restrictions, codified in Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers directives issued throughout late 1945 and early 1946, aimed to ensure Japan could not resurrect its air forces for years or decades. SCAP Directive No. 120, issued on December 13, 1945, explicitly prohibited all aircraft manufacturing in Japan. The directive covered not merely military aircraft, but also civilian aviation, eliminating the entire sector. Japanese factories that had produced aircraft were forbidden from doing so under occupation authority. Violations carried severe penalties, including criminal prosecution and potential facility seizure. The prohibition extended to aeronautical engineering and research. Universities were forbidden from conducting wind tunnel research or teaching advanced aeronautical design. Technical libraries containing aviation materials were audited, with sensitive documents confiscated. Professional organizations related to aviation were dissolved. The occupation authorities sought to eliminate not just hardware, but also institutional knowledge and technical expertise that might enable future aviation development. Pilot training, both military and civilian, was completely prohibited. Japan's extensive network of flying schools, which had trained thousands of pilots during the war, was shut down. Aircraft used for training were destroyed along with combat types. Instructors were demobilized without provision for alternative employment. The pipeline that had produced Japanese aviators was cut off completely, ensuring that Japan's pilot population would age and diminish without replacement. Colonel Armstrong's responsibilities expanded from aircraft disposal to enforcement of aviation prohibitions. His teams conducted inspections of suspected violation sites, investigating reports that Japanese individuals or organizations were attempting to preserve aircraft components or continue aviation activities covertly. These investigations revealed several attempts by former military personnel to hide aircraft or engines, usually motivated by sentiment rather than military intent, but treated seriously by occupation authorities. One notable enforcement action occurred at a facility near Nagoya, where former Mitsubishi employees had concealed a partially completed prototype aircraft, hoping to preserve it as a symbol of Japanese engineering achievement. American investigators discovered the hidden aircraft during a routine inspection, dismantled it immediately, and prosecuted several individuals involved. The incident received coverage in Japanese newspapers, serving as a warning against similar attempts elsewhere. The occupation authorities also prohibited sport aviation, gliding, and even model aircraft above certain sizes. These restrictions reflected American determination to eliminate all aspects of Japanese aviation culture, not merely military capabilities. The rationale held that any aviation activity, however innocuous, maintained skills and knowledge that might facilitate future militarization. Complete prohibition was deemed safer than attempting to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable aviation activities. Japanese reactions to these prohibitions varied. Many accepted them as inevitable consequences of defeat, understanding that victors dictate terms to the vanquished. Some resented the comprehensive nature of restrictions, particularly prohibitions on civilian aviation and sport flying, which seemed disconnected from legitimate security concerns. Former aviation personnel, their livelihoods eliminated and their expertise invalidated, experienced the prohibitions as personal tragedies compounding national defeat. The economic impact extended beyond direct aviation employment. Industries supplying materials to aircraft manufacturers lost major customers. Aluminum producers, instrument makers, propeller manufacturers, and countless other suppliers faced collapse. The occupation's aviation prohibitions rippled through Japan's industrial economy, contributing to the severe economic disruption of the immediate post-war years. Tanaka, the former maintenance officer, attempted to continue aviation work through indirect means. He secured employment at a motorcycle manufacturer, applying his mechanical knowledge to internal combustion engines for transportation rather than warfare. Many former aviation workers followed similar paths, their expertise adapted to other mechanical engineering applications. The transition was difficult, often involving substantial wage reductions and loss of professional status, but provided survival in economically devastated Japan. The prohibition period would eventually end, though not quickly. Occupation authorities maintained strict aviation restrictions through the 1940s. Limited relaxation began in the 1950s as the international situation evolved, and American perceptions of Japan shifted from defeated enemy to Cold War ally. However, genuine resumption of Japanese aviation, including indigenous aircraft manufacturing and military air forces, would require years of negotiation and American approval. Kazuki found the aviation prohibition particularly painful. Flying had been more than his profession. It had been his passion, his identity. The occupation's elimination of all aviation activities removed not just his livelihood, but his purpose. He tried to maintain connection to aviation through reading whatever materials were available, studying English-language aviation publications when he could obtain them, and maintaining contact with other former pilots. These activities provided limited solace but kept alive his connection to the domain that had defined his life. As months became years under occupation, the aircraft disposal operations and aviation prohibitions gradually faded from immediate consciousness in Japanese society. The destroyed planes, once symbols of national power and technological achievement, became historical footnotes. Occupation censorship restricted discussion of military topics in Japanese media, limiting public discourse about aviation or other aspects of the defeated military establishment. A national amnesia began to settle over the wartime period, encouraged by both occupation policies and Japanese desires to move beyond trauma. The occupation authorities implemented comprehensive censorship of Japanese media, restricting content deemed militaristic, ultra-nationalistic, or critical of occupation policies. Discussion of military achievements, valorization of combat sacrifice, or nostalgic treatment of the wartime period fell under prohibition. Japanese publishers, filmmakers, and journalists navigated these restrictions carefully, focusing content on approved topics like democratic reform, economic reconstruction, and peaceful international cooperation. This censorship environment limited public discussion of the aircraft disposal operations and their significance. Japanese citizens knew vaguely that military equipment had been destroyed and that aviation was prohibited, but detailed information about the scale and methodology of aircraft elimination was scarce. The 373 planes that vanished on particular days were not commemorated or discussed publicly. They simply ceased to exist, both physically and in public discourse. Former aviation personnel, unable to practice their profession and discouraged from discussing their wartime experiences, found themselves occupying an ambiguous social position. Their expertise was obsolete, their wartime service neither honored nor explicitly condemned, simply rendered irrelevant to Japan's occupation-directed transformation. Many chose silence, avoiding discussion of aviation or military service, focusing instead on survival and adaptation to peacetime circumstances. Kozuki embodied this pattern. He rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, even with family. When his children asked about the war, he provided minimal responses, neither glorifying nor condemning his service, simply acknowledging it had occurred and ended in defeat. This reticence was common among Japanese veterans, reflecting both occupation censorship pressures and personal psychological coping mechanisms. Speaking of the past meant confronting painful memories of death, destruction, defeat, and lost purpose. However, memory persisted in private spaces despite public silence. Former aviation personnel maintained informal networks, occasionally gathering to share experiences and maintain bonds forged during service. These gatherings occurred quietly, attracting no public attention, violating no occupation restrictions, simply allowing former comrades to remember together what could not be discussed publicly. Some individuals documented their experiences privately, writing memoirs or personal histories intended for family rather than publication. These private writings, often discovered decades later by researchers, preserved perspectives on the aircraft disposal operations and aviation prohibition period that were absent from official histories and public discourse. They revealed the human dimensions of disarmament, the psychological costs of forced erasure, and the complex emotions of individuals navigating defeat and occupation. Technical documentation also survived in unexpected places. Some former engineers and technicians retained personal notes, sketches, and calculations related to aircraft they had designed or maintained. These materials, technically violations of occupation directives requiring surrender of military-related documents, were kept secretly and rarely discussed. They represented professional pride, memories of technical achievement, and perhaps hopes that aeronautical expertise might someday regain value. The occupation censorship and aviation prohibitions gradually relaxed as the 1940s became the 1950s. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 fundamentally altered American strategic priorities in Asia. Japan's potential value as an ally against communism became apparent, leading to substantial revision of occupation policies. Restrictions on Japanese economic activity, including eventually aviation-related industries, began to loosen as American policy shifted from punishment and reform toward reconstruction and alliance building. This policy evolution occurred gradually. Initial relaxations focused on economic reconstruction, allowing Japanese industry to supply American forces fighting in Korea. Aviation-specific prohibitions remained in force longer, reflecting continued American sensitivity about Japanese rearmament. However, by the mid-1950s, discussions began about re-establishing Japanese self-defense forces, including eventually an air component, though under strict limitations and American oversight. The San Francisco Peace Treaty, signed on September 8, 1951, and entering effect on April 28, 1952, formally ended the occupation and restored Japanese sovereignty. However, the treaty and accompanying security agreements maintained American military presence in Japan and placed restrictions on Japanese remilitarization. Japanese aviation capabilities would be rebuilt, but slowly, carefully controlled, and oriented toward defensive purposes within a framework of alliance with the United States. For former aviation personnel like Kozuki and Tanaka, these policy shifts came too late to restore careers, but allowed renewed discussion of aviation topics and gradual re-establishment of aeronautical activities in Japan. Some former pilots eventually flew again, though in civilian contexts and often after years away from aviation. Some engineers returned to aircraft-related work as Japanese companies cautiously re-entered aviation manufacturing under license agreements with American firms. 7 decades after 373 Japanese planes vanished in organized disposal operations, the events remain relatively obscure in broader historical consciousness. The aircraft disposal operations, while comprehensively documented in American occupation archives, receive limited attention in popular histories of World War II or the occupation period. They lack the dramatic narrative appeal of combat operations or political transformations, appearing instead as administrative footnotes to larger historical movements. Yet these operations represented something historically significant: the systematic elimination of a defeated power's military capabilities on unprecedented scale. Previous conflicts had seen victors confiscate weapons, disband armies, and impose restrictions on the vanquished. However, the comprehensiveness of American disarmament of Japanese aviation, combining physical destruction with institutional prohibition and technological appropriation, established patterns that influenced subsequent occupations and peace settlements. The aircraft disposal operation served multiple functions simultaneously: military, political, psychological, and symbolic. Militarily, they eliminated Japanese capacity for aerial warfare, removing tools that might enable resistance to occupation or future aggression. Politically, they demonstrated American power and resolve, establishing occupation authority. Psychologically, they impressed upon Japanese military personnel and civilians the totality of defeat and futility of further resistance. Symbolically, they marked the end of Imperial Japan and beginning of a new order under American hegemony. For individuals like Kozuki, who spent decades processing his experiences, the aircraft disposal operations represented personal as well as national transformation. The young pilot who had flown combat missions defending Japan evolved into an elderly man reflecting on defeat, occupation, and reconstruction. His identity, once inseparable from military aviation, had been forcibly reconstructed around civilian occupations and peacetime values. The process was painful, but ultimately contributed to Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. Tanaka followed a different trajectory. Unable to return to aviation work for years, he eventually found employment with a Japanese manufacturer beginning to produce aircraft components under license from American companies in the late 1950s. He contributed technical expertise gained during the war to Japan's cautious re-entry into aviation, experiencing personal vindication as skills once rendered obsolete regained value. His career arc mirrored national reconstruction, moving from defeat and prohibition through gradual recovery toward renewed capability. Japan's post-war relationship with aviation evolved dramatically over subsequent decades. The nation that had seen thousands of military aircraft destroyed eventually developed a sophisticated aerospace industry, manufacturing both civilian and military aircraft. Japanese companies became major participants in international aviation, producing components for American aircraft and developing indigenous designs. The Japan Air Self-Defense Force, established in 1954, eventually operated advanced fighter aircraft and maintained capabilities that would have seemed impossible during the occupation period. This transformation occurred within frameworks established during occupation, particularly Japan's security alliance with the United States. Japanese aviation development proceeded under American oversight, and often involved licensed production of American designs rather than fully independent programs. The comprehensive destruction of Japanese aviation in 1945 and 46 eliminated continuity with wartime programs, forcing post-war Japanese aviation to begin essentially from scratch and establish new institutional foundations aligned with democratic governance and defensive strategic orientation. The 373 aircraft that vanished on specific days in 1945 symbolized this discontinuity. They represented the end of Imperial Japanese aviation, the physical severing of connections between wartime and post-war periods. Their destruction was necessary, from American perspective, to ensure defeated Japan could not resurrect militarism. From Japanese perspective, their loss was painful, but perhaps necessary for national transformation and eventual international rehabilitation. Contemporary visitors to aviation museums occasionally encounter preserved Japanese aircraft from World War II, maintained as historical artifacts in American, British, and other international collections. These survivors, pulled from the disposal stream for intelligence or historical purposes, outlasted the vast majority of their counterparts. They exist as physical reminders of technological capabilities, strategic contests, and human conflicts that shaped the Pacific century. Kozuki visited one such museum late in life, traveling to the United States and encountering a restored Mitsubishi A6M0 on display. He stood before the aircraft for long minutes, studying details he remembered from decades earlier, noticing restoration inaccuracies, and experiencing complex emotions. Pride in the machine's elegant design mingled with sadness for its combat purpose, and relief that the conflicts it represented had ended. He felt no desire to glorify war or militarism, only complicated remembrance of youth, service, and transformation. The erasure of Japanese aviation in 1945 and 1946 was comprehensive, but not permanent. The institutional knowledge, technical expertise, and cultural values related to aviation could be suppressed, but not entirely eliminated. They persisted in memories, documents, and tacit knowledge carried by individuals who had experienced the wartime aviation establishment. When circumstances permitted, this knowledge re-emerged, adapted to new contexts, and contributing to Japan's post-war development. The story of the vanished aircraft ultimately tells of destruction and reconstruction, defeat and adaptation, the exercise of power by victors and resilience of the vanquished. It reminds that historical transformations, even those appearing sudden or total, involve complex human experiences, individual adaptations, and gradual processes extending far beyond dramatic moments. The planes that vanished in fire and dismantlement left legacies in memories, documents, and national trajectories that continue to shape contemporary realities.